Hello, everyone, and welcome to this SANS webcast, Open Source Tools and Techniques for Anti-Money Laundering and Sanctions. My name is Emily Polly Newens. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for the Cyber Defense curriculum here at SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Stephen Harris. Stephen is currently a Cyber Threat Analyst at Protect Group International and a SANS Certified Instructor Candidate teaching SEC 497, Practical Open Source Intelligence. If you have any questions for Stephen during the webcast, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that our webcast is being recorded and will be available for viewing later in your SANS account under My Webcasts. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this morning, if you're in the US, or this afternoon, if you're here in Europe. And welcome to this webcast on anti-money laundering and sanctions. We're going to look specifically at open source intelligence techniques and tools that are going to help us in this growing area of importance. But just before we move into the material, I'll introduce myself very briefly and explain a little bit about my background. So I teach SANS Sec 497, which is the Practical Open Source Intelligence course. I've taught that to many students across many different countries in recent years. And we're actually finding that one of the areas where there's a huge increase in demand for skills around open source intelligence is in the world of anti-money laundering and financial crime. So this is one of the things that I hope will leave you with some practical takeaways for that to support that. When I'm not teaching at SANS, I work as a cyber threat analyst at PGI, Protection Group International. But I spent most of my career as an investigator in one way or another. And I spent 12 years working as a detective, mostly specializing in cybercrime, online investigations, and practical open source intelligence. So that's my background, and I hope I'll clarify a few things for you today. And whether you have been involved in anti-money laundering and sanctions investigations for a long time, or whether it's something you're just getting started out in, I think there will be something in this talk that that will help you and help you go and improve your workflows and enrich the type of resources that you're using to do your work in that area. So we are going to look at lots of different tools and techniques, but I'm going to pause before we start. And the reason we do that is to talk a little bit about planning and preparation. Now, I've been an investigator for a very long time, probably 15 years or so now, and I've done investigations in lots of different environments, lots of different subjects. But one of the common mistakes that people often make when they do investigations of any kind is they want to jump straight into the juicy stuff, straight onto their favorite tool, their favorite platform, their favorite resource. But you come back a little while later and they're often they're stuck. They've gone down lots of different rabbit holes. They've got a huge pile of data that they don't know what to do with. And the focus of their investigation begins to drift and they start to flag a little bit. So one of the things I always encourage new investigators to spend a little time doing when you start your investigation is do some planning and preparation and actually specify what do you want to find out, because you can find out almost anything about anyone or any organization, but we need to have a very specific idea about what it is we actually want to find out. In the context of sanctions investigations or money laundering investigations, who is this individual? What assets do they actually own? Where do they store those assets? What are their sources of income? And so on and so on and so on. And we can use open source intelligence to do that. But at the start of this webcast, just the same as at the start of any investigation, I encourage you to specify what it is you're actually trying to find out. And then the rest of your investigation will be much more focused when you keep coming back to that. And a little bit more tradecraft. So I said I've been investigating in one form or another for about 15 years or so. And I can let you into a little secret, which is despite the fact that some investigations are very, very big and they get very, very complex, at their core, they're very, very simple, because all you're doing as an investigator is making links between lots of different entities. And the sort of entities you're making links between will vary depending on the sort of thing you're investigating. So when I was a detective, I wanted to make a link between a crime scene and a suspect, or a discarded weapon and a suspect, or a witness and a crime scene. And I would use lots of different tools and techniques to make those links. And it's the same in other types of investigations as well. You are identifying entities, so your people of interest, their businesses, their addresses, their phone numbers, their emails, and so on and so on and so on. And you're trying to make links between those different entities. And although some of these investigations get very, very big and very, very complex, at their core, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make links between the different entities. And the resources we're going to look at in a moment are going to equip you to do that. In this little mock-up you can see on the screen here, I understand it's a very, very simplified version of the sort of links that you might want to be making in a money laundering or sanctions investigation. So you have your subject that you're doing due diligence on, and you want to link, well, who are their family members? What assets do they own? Are they using offshore companies? If they are, which ones? And how are they linked? And so on and so on. And if you've been involved in this kind of investigation for any length of time whatsoever, you will also realize that because of the nature of what people are doing in this area, they go to great lengths to obscure and hide these links so they can keep their money, which they may not be able to, and to thwart you as an investigator. So the more resources we're able to look up, the more data we can get about these different entities, the more likely we are to be successful in making these different links, which will help us tie our investigations together. So before we dive into the tools, I'm going to look at a real world, a practical example of this. And I'm going to look at someone who may be familiar to you. And this is a man called Roman Abramovich. He is a Russian oligarch. He made in the late 90s, early 2000, he became a billionaire off the back of his business in the Russian oil industry. And he's probably best known, certainly here in the UK, as the former owner of Chelsea Football Club. So he's quite prominent in the UK because of his links to obviously Russia, where he made his fortune, and his links to the Russian government. In early 2022, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, he was one of a number of Russian oligarchs who were sanctioned. So there was a huge amount of public information about him. But as we look at some of these different tools, we are going to use him as an example and show the kind of information that is out there for us. So that's enough PowerPoint slides. Let's dive into the tools. Any of the links that I mention, just shout out in chat, and at the end of this talk, I will make those links available to you via our Q&A option here. So just let me bring up our first resource here. And this is a tool. The first tool we're going to look at is a tool called Open Sanctions. So it's obviously a key part of sanctions investigation. We need to understand the individuals, the organizations, the other entities who have been sanctioned by governments. Because I don't want my business to accidentally supply things to a company or a country that I'm not allowed to, and that introduces risk and the possibility of fines or punishments against my own company. And I want to avoid that. So if you're working in due diligence as part of a bank, for example, or insurance or investment company, it's important to be able to navigate your way through sanctions information. And navigating your way through sanctions information is relatively straightforward, because most governments across the world will publish regularly updated lists of sanctioned individuals, companies, organizations, and so on and so on. The only problem with all these sanctions lists for you as an investigator is that every single country has its own. They're all in different formats. And so actually checking if an individual is sanctioned or not can be a very time-consuming process, and it can delay your investigations. But a few years ago, some journalists who were all struggling with this same problem created a resource called Open Sanctions. And what Open Sanctions does, it scrapes the data from the official government sanction registries and a few other sources as well, and it puts them together in a nice, easy to use, readily searchable database that makes life for us as investigators much, much easier. So thinking about Roman Abramovich, I can go to Open Sanctions here and click on search, and we will see something that is going to become a common theme when we look at some of these tools. I get several matches for Roman Abramovich. There are some other close matches as well, and we'll see how those all match. But the first match I get here is for Roman Abramovich. So let's have a look what all the sanctions registries are saying about him. So let's have a look. So here we are. This is a very, very detailed list of information, and I'm going to go through it and show you the kind of the points of information that are in there, and show you the things that are going to make a difference later on when you move from this resource to look through other resources that you might have. So bearing in mind, the source of information for most of the records here are official government registries. So generally fairly high confidence as to regards their reliability. So let's have a look at what they say about Roman Abramovich. First of all, and this might seem like a trivial point, but it's not, because it will affect the way the rest of your research goes. We know in England, certainly, we know Roman Abramovich as Roman Abramovich. But what we find, because he's a Russian national and because he has been sanctioned in many, many different countries, we find all the variables, all the variants, the different ways of spelling his name. So here he's Roman Abramovich. In some countries, he's Abramovich Roman Arkadievich, and so on and so on. And we get not only Western language names, we get his name in Cyrillic as well. So you actually see here there are several different variables and ways of spelling his name. And you might think, well, of course there is, Stephen, because he's in lots of different countries. This is a really important detail which can trip up less experienced investigators sometimes, because if you only search for the English version of the name, for example, you are going to cut off a lot of other resources that are not in English. So throughout your investigation, it's worth having a list or keeping note of all these different variables of someone's name, because you open up the wider range of possible resources. And something we always like to be able to do is to check the sources. So when I see a data point in Open Sanctions, it will actually tell me where that particular data point originated from, and it will also tell me when that information first appeared as well. This is really, really important when you're building a case, because it allows you to assess the recency of the information and the quality of the information as well. So the first one at the top of the list here, Roman Abramovich, we see it's from the GB, that's the British government sanctions list, and we see it's really recent, the 20th of April, 2023. So that gives us quite high confidence about this particular piece of information. Other really useful things, we have other names. You see here 114 different variations on his names, and of course, how his name appears in other non-Western languages as well. It's really, really key. Date of birth, we have different nationalities, places of birth, and so on. And again, it's the same with the language. Really important detail that you are unlikely to find in many other sources of information, things like passport numbers, that although you could recover some of this other kind of information through open source investigations, generally finding things like people's passport numbers can be quite difficult. The position. So again, thinking back to how we make links to people, all the different positions that he holds as a director, as a shareholder, and so on, where he went to school, where he was educated, his religion, his status, and so on and so on and so on. And again, we have these really important pieces of information about when all this was published. Those of you who've used other people's search engines, for example, will know it's quite rare to get this level of confidence from a people search engine, certainly as regards currency and date and things like that. So this is very valuable information. Moving on, we get all descriptions about him. So we see other entities he's linked to, but also the source of that information as well. And you can see it's linked heavily to lots of official different government organizations. So already thinking about those links, where we've got other countries, we have got other businesses that we now want to look at. We see, apart from government lists, he's on the ACF list of bribe takers and warmongers. And that's clearly highlighted to you as a non-official source. So it's in there, but it's not necessarily an official source, but it's useful to you. We have we see some, we've got some address information, and now we start to get down into the list of country information as well. Company information in terms of where he has directorships and shares and so on. Other types of information that we can get is around associations. So these are friends and family very often. Although, in fact, in the case of Roman Abramovich, a lot of these people who are listed as his associates are also family members. But we get more of a detailed family breakdown here. And again, if you worked in this area, you'll understand the importance of this. And the reason why this is often so important is because when people are involved in fraud, in money laundering, sanctions, things like that, and not just billionaire oligarchs, but also lower down the scale in smaller amounts of money as well, people transferring assets or transferring money to their spouses, to their children, and so on. So although for all intents and purposes, they benefit from owning a certain asset and they really control it day to day, on paper at least, it's often a family member who's responsible for that. So understanding who is in someone's family and how they are related is very, very important when it comes to making those particular links. A couple of these names we will come back to as we learn a little bit more about Mr. Abramovich. And we can see here other organizations he's linked on, and so on and so on and so on. This is a very rich, very reliable source of information. And for looking to money laundering, looking into sanctions, it's an invaluable resource. So how you can use this day to day, of course, obviously. But again, I'm very much aware of the real world that people operate in, and organizations that do anti-money laundering and sanctions investigations are often concerned with privacy and integrity of information and so on. So Open Sanctions has, if you're concerned about, well, what happens if I send my queries about my subjects to this website? Are the website going to know? I don't want them to, because we want it to keep it quiet. Open Sanctions actually make their database available for you to download and interact with offline. So you can download the Open Sanctions database as a Docker container. You can install it in your own company's environment and just make requests to that container, which will update itself, I think, every 24 hours or so. So if you're thinking, and I know certainly from my experience in law enforcement, people worry rightly about leaking information about their investigations. You can bring all this in-house and manage it yourself if that's a concern for you. So, excuse me. That's Open Sanctions. But we talked right about the start about the importance of making links. And this information will definitely help you make links. There are a number of programs which interact with, a number of platforms which interact with Open Sanctions. So there is Videris from Black Dot Solutions, there is Multigo. They can both interact with this and help you to build your links so you can present your findings in a way that is much clearer. I'm going to show you a second resource that's very closely linked to that now. And this is a resource called Open Screening. Now, Open Screening is still in development, but you can sign up for a free trial whilst they are developing it. But it will take all the information that's held within Open Sanctions and it will partly automate the visualization of that data. So we saw all these links here, really, really useful, but try conveying that in a document, it is quite tricky. It's often much easier to convey associations through visual links. And we can do that with open screening, as well as many other resources as well. So to use open screening, I have here, just let me zoom out a little bit, if I can. No, I told you it's still in development. So this is, here's Roman Abramovich here. This is, again, the same data set, but we're looking at it a different way. If I hover over him, we can see there are 47 other types of information linked to him that I might want to explore. So to do that, I've searched for him. It's brought up his profile. I can right click and I get all the details here on the left-hand side that we saw previously. But then I can choose to expand. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in the organizations that Roman Abramovich is linked to. I can click on organization. And all that we saw in the Open Sanctions database is now visualized immediately, both as an investigator and someone who's reading an investigative report. These links are now much clearer. So I always encourage students on SEC 497 and people I mentor in real life, if you can get good at visualizing your information, it conveys quite complex networks and ownership of things in a way that is very, very clear for anyone who goes to look at it. So, of course, each of these entities, these are all different organizations. We can see how they're linked to Mr. Abramovich, but there'll also be information about them at the same time. So we can pivot from these in the same way. Right click, we choose expand, and we have address, close associates. In this, and we can see for this business, which is the Regional Social Fund for National Medicine Promotion, we can see there are actually 2 other sanctioned entities linked to that. But in this case, we'll click on all neighbors. And we immediately see there's Mr. Abramovich, there's the Regional Social Fund for National Science Promotion or National Medicine Promotion. And we can see how it's then linked to other individuals. There's a name here, Oleg Deripaska. He's another sanctioned Russian oligarch. He's also linked to the same organization. We've learned that. We have a business address here. We have some other additional information as well, and so on. So we can make the most of that data and visualize and identify the relationships of interest much more quickly by using a tool like open screening or one of the other commercial tools that are available, rather than just relying on the raw information. And both as a consumer and a user of that data, it is much, much clearer. This is Linkurious open screening. It's very, very easy to use. Although, of course, because Open Sanctions has its own API, you can, of course, use that and incorporate it into any visualization tool that you prefer to use. So that's Open Sanctions. So sticking with more official sources, I'm going to introduce another tool to you now in one moment. Which right, I'm logged into that, just making sure. Okay, so now in the US, there is the SEC, where publicly listed companies have to publish information about themselves. In each different state has its own way of registering business and who owns them and where they're based and so on. In the UK, we have Companies House, where people, if they are a director or of a business, they have to register there and publish their address and outline very briefly what the business does. In pretty much every country across the world, there are these official registries where this kind of information is held. Again, the quality of the data tends to be of higher quality because it's an official source, although Companies House here in the UK, for example, will tell you in the small print that they won't vouch for the accuracy of what's in there. And sometimes people make mistakes or people are dishonest and they put information which is in there and it's not always verified, but on the whole, it's high quality, reliable information. So with the same principle that Open Sanctions was founded so that researchers don't have to go through every single registry in every single country in the world, Open Corporates has done the same thing, but has pulled all the data from these official national registries into a simple, easy to search database. So here, for example, if I search for, let's search for Roman Abramovich, and we actually find, and this will not be surprising to you if you've done any research in this area, that he, as an officer of a company, there are relatively few entries for him, but we do get some information. So we find that he was the director of the Business Financial Industry Corporation, which is registered in Panama, and he's actually registered to he has another role at that same organization. We also find when a company has been dissolved or struck off, they are still archived, so it's possible to research archived information here as well. Let's have a look at one of these and links and see what they show. So Open Corporates is free to use, by the way. However, fairly recently, it does require you to create an account, which is free up to a certain level, but it's you do need to log in. But once you're logged in, you can access all this stuff. So again, thinking, how do we make links to individuals, businesses, and so on? This is the entry for Roman Abramovich. And we find this company, Business Financial Industry Corporation, PLC, we find there are lots and lots of other people in this organization. Some of them are directors, some of them are secretaries, and so on and so on. And we get all this information here. And then we can sort of pivot from here and click on one of the other people. In this case, Vladimir Barankos. And we can see there are lots of other people with the same name who are also directors of many, many other companies in Panama. So you can almost see how this would work, how you could make the link between between Abramovich and many, many other individuals and organizations. But of course, because the nature of sanctions and money laundering and company ownership, people who are trying to hide their wealth, perhaps, are rarely so helpful for investigators as to make everything very, very clear and transparent. So we often have to really dig into some of these relationships and some of these connections to find out more about them. So when we were looking at Open Sanctions, we said we would have a look at some of his family members as well. Now, Roman Abramovich has been married at least twice. I think he's on his third wife now. But he, both of his previous wives, his first wife and his second wife, often ended up being the owners, on paper at least, of many of the other entities that really were funded by Roman Abramovich. And as I said before, it's very common that people will do that sort of thing. So one of the people that I've searched on here is I've used the name Dasha Zhukova, who is Roman Abramovich's second wife. But if we would search her full name, I think is Alexandra Zhukova. If we searched on that name, we wouldn't actually find so many matches, because as we saw with Open Sanctions, people use so many different variables of their name, either due to language or nicknames or and so on and so on, that it's important to search across all of them. So if you searched for Roman Abramovich's family members by their full official names, you wouldn't find all that many things. But his wife, we learned from Open Sanctions, takes the nickname or the shortened version Dasha Zhukova. And so we search for that in here, and we find that she doesn't own many businesses as such, but the one she is linked to is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is in New York. And we see all the other people there who, along with Dasha, are directors of that particular organization. Why is this interesting? Well, if you look at this entry in isolation, perhaps it's not all that interesting. Okay, we know she's has quite a high public profile because she's heavily involved in art and has been for many years. But actually, we learn very recently, as in within the last week, the Guardian newspaper here in the UK published an article partly based on research from Open Corporates, which said that Mr. Abramovich, as part of the sanctions that were enforced upon him transferred the ownership of roughly $1 billion worth of art to his partner, Dasha Zhukova. So now we find there's this huge question about, well, what's going to happen to this $1 billion worth of artwork? But obviously his ex-wife, Dasha, is very, very heavily linked to the world of art. So there are now lots of investigative journalists digging into that, using resources like this to say, well, is it really hers? Does it really belong to Mr. Abramovich? Where have all the paintings gone? How did he pay for them all? And so on and so on and so on. But it's homing in on little clues like this, like the fact she's heavily connected to the art world, which help to explain other pieces of the puzzle. So that's open corporates. Again, high quality data, it's updated regularly. If there is a business or an individual in open corporates that's not up to date, you can request that they update it. They do also have an API. So if you want to do this programmatically and incorporate open corporate information into your own tools and services, of course, you can do that by signing up and getting an API subscription. So that's open corporates. I see there's a few questions in chat. I'll jump onto those at the end and do my best to answer the questions that you've given me, that you've asked. So let's go in a very, very different direction. So the two resources we've looked at so far, Open Sanctions and Open Corporates, are official sources of information that are scraped and compiled from official sources. A few years ago, some hackers working in cooperation with some investigative journalists started to hack their way into various offshore businesses and law firms, often based in places like the Bahamas or Panama and so on, and actually steal their client databases. And the first one, I think, was called the Panama Papers, because they stole gigabytes and gigabytes worth of data from law firms in Panama. And there have been other leaks since. The common theme amongst all these is that the data has been leaked by or stolen from lots of other organizations who specialize in providing offshore financial and legal services. So the Offshore Leaks database has taken all this data, has tidied it up so it's easy to search, and made it accessible for researchers to find. Why is this so valuable? Well, this is the information that you won't necessarily, in fact, you almost certainly won't get from official sources. The reason people prefer to use offshore services are to so either usually for tax or for legal reasons or for the privacy that those facilities bring. And this is information that the people who use it don't want to be in the public domain. But this is all leaked information. So it's not sort of information you're going to get from official sources. One thing you need to be absolutely clear about, especially when it comes to investigating criminality or suspected criminality, the mere use of offshore services is by itself not illegal. And you can see that in this banner that doesn't go off your page at the bottom here. Just because someone or a company are in this database does not mean that they are involved in illegal activity. But people who often are involved in illegal activity do sometimes use these services. And after this, you can have a look at the ICIJ website that they have at some of the wrongdoing and corruption that they have exposed through their access to these databases. So coming back to Roman Abramovich, well, he's an oligarch, he's sanctioned. Is he the sort of person who we might want to find in an offshore leak? Well, we would certainly want to have a look. So he can put his name into the Offshore Leaks database. And we see, actually, although it says here there are 349 officers and all these different entities, these are all approximate matches. And we don't find, actually, Roman Abramovich named specifically in any of them. Because, of course, people aren't so obvious as if they are trying to use offshore services. They don't advertise that fact. And there are often many, many different layers of companies and organizations that people transfer or move their wealth through in order to try and hide it from people who are trying to investigate it. So there is no easy smoking gun, but that is rarely the case that you get something so easy in these types of investigations. But let's have a look at the sort of things we might find. So here, for example, sorry, if you didn't see what I did there, I searched for Roman Abramovich. There was no match here up at the top, a clear match anyway. The second match is Irina Abramovich. So we'll click on her and then we'll have a look. Now, Irina Abramovich, if you remember from the family information that we saw way back when we were looking at open sanctions, Irina Abramovich is the first wife of Roman Abramovich. And remember, we've seen that tactic that actors in this space use of putting assets into the names of their spouses, into the names of their children, and so on and so on and so on. And Irina Abramovich appeared in one of the offshore leaks. And as I say, all the information from these leaked databases has been processed and tidied and made very, very easy to visualize. So let's have a look at what we found out about Irina Abramovich. So first of all, we get the information about which particular offshore registry this came from. And we can see it came from the Malta corporate registry. And we also get the currency date as well. We can see this was current up until 2016. So it's not the most up to date, but now at least we know when this data was good for. And again, there's a chance to pivot here back to open corporates where we were before. So these connections are much clearer. And this is what I really like about the offshore leaks database. The data is already visualized for you so that the relationships are very, very clear. Let's have a look. So here is Irina Abramovich, and I can click and drag this around just to make it a little bit more interesting. If I click on her, I get some of the information, which leak it came from, the Paradise Papers in this case, and any other information about her. And then I can see here all the different links between her and this company called Gabriel Malta Limited. You can see she's the legal representative of the company. She's a director, the judicial representative, and a shareholder of Gabriel Malta Limited. And it might not be obvious what Gabriel Malta do. But I can click on them and see the company's been struck off. We can learn a little bit more about them by clicking down here. So if I were to click on these links here, it would take me to additional information about these particular individuals. Other really interesting data point here. We see Irina Abramovich is linked to this address in London, 55 or 56 Chester Square in London. I'll save you doing the research on that, but that was when she was married to Roman Abramovich, and he was still the owner of Chelsea Football Club. This was their home address. This is where they lived in London. It was one of the most expensive houses in the city. And because this information would previously have been hidden due to the nature of the offshore leaks, we now, because that information has been put into the public domain, we can now see a much clearer link between their home address, the person, Roman Abramovich's spouse, and this offshore company, Gabriel Malta Limited. I think from memory, Gabriel Malta, they were involved in ownership of a sub-company which was linked to ownership of a few jet airliners that Abramovich owned. So if you have never bought a jet airliner for your spouse and you're thinking about doing so, this is how that model might work. But in Mr. Abramovich's case, this is how ownership of some of the airliners he used was linked indirectly through the Gabriel companies back to his wife. So when you have a subject that you're investigating, be that a person, a business, and so on, if you keep coming up against that brick wall, think, can't find anything, have a look into some of these leaked databases. They may not have been intended to be made public, but they have been made public, and it will give you insights into people that are using them. They are still adding to this. I believe there are unprocessed databases that are still being added to it. And again, if you're concerned about, well, will offshore leaks know Can I use this within my own organization? This data is available to download, I think for free. I think it's free, but you can download this information and incorporate it into your own data sets within your organization. So if you're not comfortable with using a third-party website, you can ingest that data and make use of it in your own environment to add those little insights into the people and companies that you are investigating. So that's the offshore leaks database. Okay, let's look at one last resource. And this is a resource that has been around for a while, but recently it's had quite a few updates recently and some extra features added. And it was already useful in the past. It is even more useful now. And this is a tool called OCCRP Aleph. OCCRP stands for Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So it's predominantly run by investigative journalists, and they have collected over the years data from official sources, as we've seen already. It's like things like Companies House, but they have also collected leaked information, not just like the Panama Papers, but sometimes information that was classified or has come from foreign governments, leaked emails, that kind of thing. All this information is in here. If you remember, a few years ago in the US, there were some Democrat Party emails that were leaked. I think initially they were published on WikiLeaks, but all that information is in here. It's indexed, and you can search it. So as a tool for you, this is going to point you to some official resources similar to the ones we've already looked at, but it's also going to point you to some grey data, which is certainly going to give you insight into the individuals you're investigating, even if the information was never intended to be made public. So let's have a little bit of a look, and we'll go back to searching for Roman Abramovich. Oh, sorry, I've spelled that wrong. Hang on, sorry, let me search in the right field. That will be helpful, wouldn't it? Abramovich. Okay, so search for Roman Abramovich, who is the subject of this little demonstration. And it tells us we found 902 different pieces of information for them. Well, let's have a look at what they show and why it may or may not be useful to us. So the first one here, Roman Abramovich Limited. It's an official source, so we can click on that. We get lots of information. This is information from, see the source link, business.data.gov.uk. This is an official resource, a government resource, UK people with significant control. This is really important when you're looking at money laundering and sanctions, because as well as finding sort of who owns a company, company owners are also required to report who the actual beneficial owners are of an organization. So even if I put something in someone else's name, I'm still required to declare who the ultimate, the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner is. That has got challenging recently because some of these registries in some countries in Europe have gone from being public and following GDPR legislation have now been made private. So this aspect of money laundering investigations has got a little bit more difficult recently. So it's good, apart from anything else, to have access to the historic information via a platform like this. So we can see Roman Abramovich Limited from official sources. We've got from Companies House as well. But then we've got this really weird bit of information here, which I click on from a web page, 08 Vladivostok 68.html. These are US government cables that were intercepted, stolen, and leaked to the internet. This was very sensitive information, but it has been incorporated into the OCCRP project, and now it's available for anyone to search through. So we have here all information. This was sort of a short intelligence summary about what's happening in Russia at this particular time. And Roman Abramovich, who was amongst his many other business interests, was also the governor of Chukotka in Russia previously. And there's some background information on him, some information about his net worth. Remember, the original intended audience for this was just inside the US government. But as a result of some leaks, it's now available to research. So it's all very interesting, but think about how this might help you better understand the risk to your business, to your company, to the bank you work for, if you also have access to this information in addition to some of the more the more official resources as well. And there's all information here. We have this lady here, someone's personal notebook who was leaked, and in it she was plotting about how she was going to steal Roman Abramovich away from his wife. We've got the sanctions database, and so on and so on and so on. Loads and loads of information. There are also, by the way, full PDF and Microsoft Word documents in here that have all been indexed and remain searchable as well. Okay, and if we click over on the left, you see loads and loads of different sources, some official, some not, some highly sensitive. So this is the OCCRP Aleph project. It's free to use. It does require you to create an account, and it's going to give you insight into individuals and companies that you may not necessarily get through any other means. I will also show you, whilst we're looking at the OCCRP Aleph, a relatively new feature, which is that they have set up a platform that allows you to manage and visualize your own investigations on the platform. So it's fairly new. It is not as powerful as some of the other visualization tools that we've either looked at or other ones that are available commercially. But what it allows you to do is, when you have your subject of interest, in this case, Roman Abramovich, it allows you to enrich the data you have about that person by doing what it calls cross-referencing. So in true kids TV style, here is one I prepared earlier. OCCRP will allow me to create a network diagram to link the different entities and individuals that I'm interested in. So I can start with Roman Abramovich, and nothing here is there's no automation of this, so I can't right click and say go and find me all the people that are linked to him in the way I could with Open Sanctions, for example. But as I plot my investigation, I can add other entities on here to make visualizing the links to them much more straightforward. Another thing that you can do here is you can upload your own data and upload your own documents. So if you have your own leak, well, not your own information, you can upload that and share that on the platform. You can cooperate with other investigators on this platform as well. Depending on your use case, that may not be a desirable solution. Certainly most of the investigative organizations I work for, that would be an absolute no-no. But for some people, it may work. Probably the best feature of the investigations part of this is when you have your entity. So in this case, Roman Abramovich, I can do what is called cross-referencing. I put my entity in, I will click on the compute icon here, and it will go and pull me all the other mentions of that entity from their database. So it will tell me what the data is, so what I put in, the possible matches for it, and it will tell me the database where this particular kind of information came from, and so on and so on and so on. So then I can begin to add these into my investigation as I need. I can export that as well. It does take, when you run the compute, and the reason I didn't demonstrate this to you live, it does take probably for a single entity, maybe 4 or 5 minutes to go through everything. The more entities you have, the longer doing all that computing will take. But it's for a quick, easy visualization and data enrichment, it is going to give you a fantastic insight into some of those activities that you do need to know about, but which might not be presented to you in a way that is particularly obvious going forward. So we have a few minutes left of this webcast. I hope the tools I've shown you, if you already knew them, I hope you've learned something new about them. If they were not familiar to you, I hope you'll be able to go away and start to incorporate them into your work. It's going to help you build your skills and build your knowledge set as investigators. We do have a few minutes left, and I've got lots of notifications on my screen with some of these questions. So I'm going to work my way through them, and I'll answer these live rather than type them out if that's okay. So our first question there has been answered yet. This recording will be available. It'll be accessible via your SANS portal, which you'll be able to sign up for. I believe may also go on YouTube on one of the SANS channels, but that will be a bit further down the line. So first question is from Chandra. Does Open Sanctions aggregate data from all official sanctions lists or just the major ones? I wouldn't say for certain that I know it takes them from every single sanctions resource in the world. However, it is extremely comprehensive and takes in most of the major sanctions lists that I am aware of, as well as some unofficial sources as well, like bribery and corruption indexes and so on and so on. But certainly the majority of their data. And I believe from having seen an interview or with one of the people who set it up previously, if you know a source that you would like to be in there, then please reach out to them and say that you think it should be incorporated. Okay. A question from Daniel. How do we assess the trustworthiness of various government designating authorities in their due diligence practices? Okay. That's a good question, because no due diligence is perfect, and often on the outside we have to take it on trust that as to the rationale as to why a particular government has chosen to sanction certain individuals or not. They do often make their rationale clear, but it's not always possible on the outside to see how they come to their conclusion. So there is an extent to which we have to take it on trust. But in terms of business risk, even if a government has said that particular individual is sanctioned, then they're sanctioned. And even if that was the wrong decision, my business is still exposed to the risk if I trade with this person. So it's kind of important to be aware of that. But yeah, how good they are and how trustworthy they are. They will make mistakes for sure. Everybody does, but I don't have any insight into how these organizations prepare their sanctions list beforehand. But thanks for sharing the link to that article. I'll have a read of that afterwards. Okay. Wilson found that our mainstream tools work very poorly in Asian jurisdictions, mainly in China, Hong Kong, Japan, and Korea. I never find anything useful on these jurisdictions and ICIJ and open corporates. What's your approach when investigating Asia? That's actually that's a really good question, Wilson. I noticed you've also got a second question there about the ICIJ records. So I'll come to them separately. For Asian companies, I'm less sure. I mean, both in my previous career and now I do less work on Asian countries than I do on Western ones, so I'm not as familiar with the tools that do that. I know that certainly for China, the search engines like Baidu do allow you to do searches, albeit in Chinese, for their sort of equivalent of business registries. But I'm not aware of any sort of centralizing resources like OCCRP or Open Corporates that will also cover those countries as well. If anyone knows of any that you use, feel free to drop them in chat. But yeah, it's a really good point, Wilson. I'm less well cited on the tools that I use in that part of the world. So for public access to the original documents, the original sources for the ICIJ and the OCRP, I don't think, in fact, I'm fairly certain that certainly for the ICIJ, I don't think they make the actual original raw data databases available. They do make the past tidied data sets available, I think as CSV files, so you can add them into your own stuff. And the same for the OCCRP. And I'm sure I would have, maybe this might be my memory playing trick somebody. I'm sure that previously, if they had a Microsoft Word document, they would actually upload that document. Now, using it more recently, I've seen that less and less. So you get sort of a sanitized, well-presented version of the data in HTML format. Whether they would make the original available to you or not, I'm not sure. But they make. I don't feel like they're holding anything back, if that makes sense. You've probably just seen the data in a much more parsed, easy to read and access format. Okay. Mamuka, thank you very much. Glad you enjoyed the presentation. Are there any resources on the dark web that might be useful when investigating anti-AML and sanctions related matters? Not in a necessarily direct sense, only in the sense that a lot of leaked data that is ultimately useful in investigations like this can sometimes start out on the dark web, or it can start out on places like Telegram. So if you have a look at, there's a clear web GitHub repository called Deep Dark CTI, and Deep Dark CTI keeps a list, and it's updated very regularly, of the sites on the ClearNet, Telegram, and the Darknet where leaks are made available. A lot of them are more related to security, so people's usernames, passwords, that kind of thing. But if often the first place that a company's data gets dropped is on resources like that. So if you go to Deep Dark CTI, have a look through some of those resources, it will give you an idea of how likely they are to be able to help you. As you're working through an investigation into an individual and their business connections, what's the biggest challenge that you face? So the biggest challenge is because you're in real life, you're obviously dealing with so many layers of obfuscation around who really owns a business, who is really benefiting from it, how is it financed. And certainly when I was in the police in the UK, it was great because you could, in addition to the open source intelligence and the public registries, you could require organizations to hand records to you, which might make things a little bit easier. What makes this very, very hard, both for traditional investigators and investigative journalists, is when you hit that wall so you hit foreign countries where the data just isn't available, or you hit offshore registries where the data is well hidden and they won't cooperate with you. And some people who are hiding their criminal assets or evading sanctions go to great lengths to hide what they're doing. So sometimes the layers of obscurity can be very difficult. And when they're sort of beyond arm's reach, that is the most challenging for sure. So which of these tools can tell you more about anti-money laundering? So to answer your question, I mean, one of the aspects of anti-money laundering is identifying what people are doing with their assets. So these tools, and there's anti-money laundering and sanctions are two separate strands of investigation, but they do overlap a lot in terms of the data that they need. So anti-money laundering, when you're looking at things like what people's true income, where do they really work, where do they really live, what does their business really do, who really owns it, the know your customer stuff, especially when you're dealing with higher net worth individuals who might have more complex businesses set up, things like that. These resources are going to help you make some of those links between the people, the businesses, the income, and so on and so on, which might not always be so straightforward. So yeah, these resources will help bring clarity to what someone really does or owns. And of course, if you are doing know your customer or other anti-money laundering investigations for a bank and so on, you do get the information from within your organization, from credit reference agencies and so on, which you can add, which complement this data that you can do from the outside too. Are there any alerts that could be set up if a client's information appears on any of these sites or the dark web? So I'm not sure, unless you, it depends on the platform. Actually, that's quite a good question. And there are probably one of the best and easiest ways, Simon, of doing that. So this doesn't apply for the dark web, but in general is looking at Google Alerts. So if you go to alerts.google.com, you can set up keywords for people or organization that you're interested in and get an alert every time Google indexes a new bit of the web that mentions the company that you are interested in. For the dark web, that is a little bit more difficult. Probably the easiest place to start doing that, that I can recommend off the top of my head, is a website called Armia. That's ahmia.fi, armia.fi. That is a search engine for the dark web. It's continuously crawling the internet, and you can go on, use Armia. It's a ClearNet website, but it will crawl the darknet, and you can search for your company, your people that you're interested in, and put their details into there. Try AML Toolbox. So yeah, David, that's a I think this is one of the bookmark collections of tools for anti-money laundering investigators. Okay. Helpful update from Alan. Chat is disabled, so if you have South Korea, anyone can access free government databases of listed corporations and sole proprietorships. But of course, the websites themselves are in Korean. Yep, but that's really good. So that answers, I think, it's a question from Wilson earlier on. That's going to help you with some of the questions that you might have for investigating stuff in Southeast Asia. Okay, lastly, Mark, so did I use a sock puppet when I established my OCCRP account? I have to. So for the account that I have shown you today, I created it specifically for this investigation. You might see on your screen, it's still got my real name up in the corner. I won't do any sensitive work on there. For when I want to use this, I will probably sign up with an account that's not in my name, but some kind of sock puppet account, and then bring that data offline to incorporate into my investigations. Yeah. So in this particular one you see in front of you, I didn't use a sock puppet for my real world work. Yes, I would use it for that kind of information. Okay. Right. So Emily's giving you all the updates about the slide. If there's no more questions, I'm ready to hand back to Emily. Just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to join me. I hope you found something useful, some tools you can take back into your workplace and begin to improve the way you conduct your open source intelligence research. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you online again for another one of our webcasts next month, I think. Thank you very much, everybody, and back to you, Emily.